He thought ignoring her would protect his reputation, but he had no idea he was about to lose everything. The conference room on the 27th floor of St. Augustine Medical Center gleamed under soft recessed lighting, its glass walls overlooking a sprawling skyline of downtown Chicago where ambulances moved like distant whispers below. Inside, the air carried a quiet tension, the kind that only gathered when decisions mattered, when lives hung not on emotion, but on precision. Around the long polished oak table sat the most respected minds in the state, specialists, surgeons, department heads, each dressed in tailored suits or pristine white coats that signaled years of authority and recognition. At the center sat Dr. Jonathan Reeves, chairman of the elite medical review board, his silver hair perfectly combed, his voice measured and controlled as he reviewed the case projected on the large screen. Male, 52, progressive neurological decline, symptoms worsening despite standard treatment protocols, he said, tapping a pen lightly against his folder. The sound echoed faintly in the otherwise silent room. Every eye remained fixed forward, except for one. At the far end of the table, nearly outside the circle of influence, sat Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible, dressed in a simple navy cardigan over a plain blouse, her notes neatly arranged in front of her. No one had introduced her. No one had asked her to speak. In fact, most of them hadn't even looked at her since she walked in. To them, she was just another support staff member, perhaps a junior consultant or an assistant brought in to observe. And that was exactly how Dr. Reeves intended it. We proceed with the current treatment plan, he continued confidently, glancing briefly around the table for agreement. Heads nodded. Pens moved. Decisions were being sealed in real time. Sarah's eyes lifted from her notes to the screen, her gaze steady, focused, not uncertain, not hesitant. She had been listening to every word, every assumption, every overlooked detail. The room buzzed with quiet certainty, the kind that comes when people believe they are unquestionably right. She shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notebook as if weighing something unseen. Then, carefully, almost gently, she opened her mouth to speak. "Excuse me," she began, her voice calm but soft. It barely traveled across the table before it was cut off. Dr. Reeves didn't even turn his head. "We're in the middle of a board review," he said flatly, dismissively, as if swatting away a distraction. A few faint smirks appeared around the table. One doctor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while another exchanged a glance with his colleague, the unspoken message clear: this wasn't her place. Sarah closed her mouth. For a moment, she said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, as if a switch had quietly flipped. The meeting continued without her, voices layering over one another, conclusions forming, authority reinforcing itself in a closed loop. And still, she sat there, silent, watching, listening, waiting, because what none of them realized, not Dr. Reeves, not the board, not a single person in that room, was that the quiet woman they had just dismissed had already seen the flaw that would change everything. And when she finally spoke again, there would be no ignoring her. The decision moved forward as if her voice had never existed, signatures forming in quiet agreement while the large screen displayed charts that told only part of the story. Dr. Reeves leaned back slightly, satisfied, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as the room settled into a rhythm of confirmation. "We will finalize the protocol and notify the attending team within the hour," he said, his tone carrying the weight of final authority. Around him, the board members nodded, some already closing their folders, others checking their watches, confident that another complex case had been handled with precision and expertise. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the space between them, a mechanical calm that masked the underlying tension of a decision made too quickly. At the far end of the table, Sarah Mitchell remained still, her pen resting untouched against her notebook. Her eyes moved once more to the screen, tracing the sequence of symptoms, the lab values, the imaging summaries that had been presented as conclusive. To anyone else, it was a closed case. To her, it was a pattern that did not align, a detail overlooked, a connection dismissed. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly. The room continued without her, conversations shifting toward logistics, timelines, and public statements. One physician joked lightly about the complexity of modern diagnostics, drawing a few quiet chuckles. Another commented on how fortunate the patient was to have access to such an elite panel. The confidence in the room was unshaken, almost rehearsed, as if doubt itself had no place at the table. Sarah's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her notebook, not in hesitation, but in restraint. She had seen this before. Rooms filled with credentials. Decisions made within echo chambers. Voices like hers filtered out before they could fully form. For a moment, she allowed the silence to linger, measuring it, understanding it. Then, as Dr. Reeves reached for his pen to sign the final authorization, she spoke again, this time without asking for permission. The diagnosis is incomplete. Her voice was no longer soft. It carried, clear and steady, cutting cleanly through the layered conversations. The effect was immediate. Pen stopped. Heads turned. The faint hum of the room seemed to collapse into stillness. Dr. Reeves froze mid-motion, his expression tightening as he slowly lifted his gaze toward her. "I am sorry," he said, his tone controlled but edged with irritation. "But this board has already reached a consensus." A few members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to ignore her or confront the disruption. Sarah did not look away. "You have identified the symptoms," she continued calmly, "but you have misinterpreted the progression." A murmur rippled through the table, subtle but unmistakable. One of the neurologists leaned forward slightly, curiosity breaking through his earlier indifference. Dr. Reeves set his pen down deliberately, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice now sharper, testing. There was a pause, brief but heavy, as every eye in the room settled on her. Sarah placed her hand gently on the table, her movements controlled, precise. "I am suggesting that if you proceed with this treatment," she said, her gaze unwavering, "you will be treating the symptom, not the cause." The words landed differently this time, not as an interruption, but as a challenge. The room did not laugh. It did not dismiss her outright. Instead, it held its breath, suspended between certainty and the first flicker of doubt. The silence that followed her words did not break easily. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was recalibrating around a voice it had already decided did not matter. Dr. Reeves leaned back slowly, his expression no longer dismissive but sharpened, the kind of focus reserved for challenges he intended to dismantle. "That is a very bold claim," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority, "especially from someone who has not been part of this case review." A few heads nodded in quiet agreement, the familiar hierarchy reasserting itself as if to restore order. One cardiologist cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "We have reviewed all available data," he added, his tone measured but firm, "extensively." Sarah did not respond immediately. She reached for her notebook, flipping it open with deliberate care, her movements unhurried in contrast to the tightening atmosphere around her. "You reviewed the data that was presented," she said quietly, "not the data that was missing." The words landed with a different weight this time, not confrontational, but precise. Across the table, a younger physician frowned slightly, glancing back at the screen as if searching for something he might have overlooked. Dr. Reeves noticed the shift and leaned forward, his presence reclaiming the center of the room. "If you have something to say, doctor," he said, emphasizing the title with subtle skepticism, "you should be very clear about it." The room stilled again, all attention narrowing toward her. Sarah placed her notebook flat on the table and turned it slightly so that the closest members could see the handwritten notes. Inside, lines of observations, timestamps, correlations drawn with careful precision. "The neurological decline is not primary," she said, her voice steady, gaining strength with each word. "It is secondary to a systemic issue that has not been addressed." A faint murmur moved through the group, quieter now, more uncertain. The neurologist who had spoken earlier leaned closer, his brows tightening. "What systemic issue?" he asked, no longer dismissive, but cautious. Sarah lifted her gaze, meeting his directly. "An autoimmune response triggered by an undiagnosed metabolic imbalance," she said. "It is rare, but not unheard of. The progression pattern matches exactly, including the fluctuation intervals that were dismissed as anomalies." She gestured toward the screen, not aggressively, but with quiet certainty. "Those anomalies are not noise. They are the signal. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time. One of the board members reached for the remote, pulling up the patient's chart, scanning it with a new lens. Dr. Reeves remained still, but his expression had changed, the confidence in his posture now tempered by something else, something he did not yet want to acknowledge. "And your evidence?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled than before. Sarah did not hesitate. "Published case studies from the past 5 years," she replied. "Clinical trials that did not receive widespread attention because the condition was considered too rare for standard protocols." She paused briefly, then added, "But the pattern is there, if you know where to look." The room did not interrupt her. No one laughed. No one dismissed her. Instead, they listened, not because they wanted to, but because something in her certainty made it impossible not to. And for the first time since the meeting began, the authority in the room did not feel absolute. It felt questioned. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was tangible, like a pressure change that no one could ignore. Several members leaned forward now, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet urgency as they re-examined the data on the screen. The neurologist who had questioned her earlier adjusted his glasses and began scrolling through the patient's chart with increasing intensity. "These fluctuation intervals," he murmured, almost to himself. They were flagged but never fully investigated. Another physician pulled up a secondary report, comparing timestamps, cross-referencing lab results that had been previously dismissed as inconsistencies. The quiet clicks of keyboards and the soft tapping of screens filled the space, replacing the earlier certainty with something far less comfortable. Dr. Reeves remained still at the head of the table, but his eyes had not left Sarah. The authority he carried was still present, but it was no longer unchallenged. "You are asking this board to reconsider an entire diagnostic direction based on a rare condition that has not been conclusively established in this patient," he said, his voice measured, carefully controlled. It was not a dismissal this time. It was a defense. Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. "I am asking you to consider that the evidence you already have does not support your conclusion," she replied calmly. "The pattern is not theoretical. It is present. You just did not follow it far enough." A faint tension tightened across the table. One of the senior physicians shifted in his chair, glancing between Sarah and the screen. "If she is right," he said slowly, "then the current treatment plan could be ineffective." He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. The implication hung in the air. Ineffective meant time lost. Time lost meant consequences no one in that room wanted attached to their decision. Dr. Reeves exhaled quietly, his fingers pressing against the table as he leaned forward. "And you are certain of this?" he asked, his voice lower now, less performative, more direct. Sarah did not rush her answer. "I am certain that the current diagnosis does not explain the full progression," she said. "And I am certain that if you continue on this path, you will miss the window where intervention could make a difference." The room fell into a deeper silence than before. This was no longer about theory. It was about responsibility. A younger doctor, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. Hesitantly, "There is a study," he said, scrolling quickly through his tablet, "published 3 years ago, limited distribution, but it mentions a similar metabolic trigger linked to autoimmune response." He looked up, his eyes flicking towards Sarah with a mixture of surprise and respect. "It matches what she is describing." The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Heads turned, not toward Dr. Reeves this time, but toward her. The woman who had been ignored minutes ago was now the center of the room's attention. Dr. Reeves noticed it. The change in alignment. The subtle redistribution of authority. He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second before he masked it. "Bring the study up," he said firmly. The screen changed, new data replacing the old conclusions, and as the information unfolded, the room grew quieter with each passing second. Sarah did not speak again. She did not need to. The evidence was speaking for her now, and for the first time since the meeting began, the confidence that had filled the room was no longer directed outward. It was collapsing inward, piece by piece, under the weight of something they had all overlooked. The new data filled the screen in quiet, undeniable clarity, lines of text and figures aligning with a precision that no longer left room for interpretation. The physician who had pulled up the study leaned forward, scrolling slowly as if each line required confirmation. Autoimmune cascade triggered by metabolic imbalance, he read aloud, his voice lower now, almost cautious. Progression pattern includes intermittent neurological decline, fluctuation intervals consistent with what we are seeing here. A subtle tension rippled through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but deeply unsettling. Several members exchanged glances, their earlier certainty dissolving into something far less comfortable. The neurologist who had first spoken sat back in his chair, his expression tightening as he compared the study to the patient's chart. The markers match, he said quietly. We flag them, but we categorize them as irregularities. He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, they were not irregularities. The words seemed to echo more than they should have. Dr. Reeves remained silent, his gaze fixed on the screen, his mind recalculating in real time. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it was shifting, adjusting to a reality that no longer supported his initial conclusion. Around the table, the quiet confidence that once filled the space had been replaced by careful scrutiny, each member now looking not at each other, but at the evidence itself. Sarah stood exactly where she had been, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table. She did not interrupt. She did not press her advantage. She simply watched as the room caught up to what she had already seen. If this diagnosis is correct, another physician said slowly, then the current treatment plan will not only be ineffective, it will delay the intervention we actually need. No one argued. No one dismissed the statement. Instead, the weight of it settled across the table, heavy and undeniable. Dr. Reeves finally moved, reaching for the remote and adjusting the display to highlight the patient's timeline. His movements were deliberate, controlled, but there was no mistaking the shift in his approach. He was no longer presenting. He was analyzing. Walk us through it, he said, his voice quieter now, directed at Sarah. It was not an invitation filled with warmth. It was something else. Recognition. The room went still again, but this time it was different. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of attention. Every eye turned to her, waiting. Sarah stepped forward slightly, her gaze moving to the screen as she began to speak. The initial symptoms were misclassified as isolated neurological events, she said, her voice steady, clear. But if you map them against the metabolic fluctuations, a different pattern emerges. She reached toward the display, pointing to specific intervals, her movements precise. Here, here, and here. These are not random. They are responses. The immune system is reacting to an underlying imbalance that has not been treated. The room followed her hand, her logic unfolding step by step, each connection, building on the last with quiet inevitability. No one interrupted. No one challenged. The authority in the room had shifted completely now, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity. And at the head of the table, Dr. Reeves watched in silence, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more difficult to hold on to. Because for the first time that morning, he was no longer the one leading the room. And everyone could feel it. The room moved with her now, not ahead of her, not around her, but with her, as if every word she spoke had quietly redrawn the structure of authority itself. Sarah's voice remained calm, steady, each sentence delivered with the same measured precision that had begun to dismantle the board's earlier certainty. If the metabolic imbalance is addressed first, she continued, her eyes scanning the data, the autoimmune response stabilizes. The neurological symptoms are not the primary condition. They are a consequence. A cardiologist nodded slowly, almost unconsciously, as if his understanding had shifted without his permission. Another physician adjusted his chair, leaning closer to the screen, his earlier skepticism replaced by focused attention. What would the treatment protocol look like? He asked, no longer dismissive, but genuinely seeking clarity. Sarah did not hesitate. Targeted metabolic correction combined with immunomodulatory therapy, she replied. But timing is critical. The intervention window narrows with each cycle of misdiagnosis. The words landed with quiet urgency. No alarm, no dramatics, just a simple truth that carried weight because of how clearly it was delivered. At the head of the table, Dr. Reeves exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing together as he considered the implications. The room watched him, waiting, but for the first time, his silence did not command the space. It followed it. You are suggesting we pivot the entire treatment plan, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. Sarah met his gaze. I am suggesting you align it with the actual condition, she replied. No one spoke after that. The statement did not challenge him directly, but it did something more difficult. It removed the illusion that his authority alone could define the outcome. A quiet tension settled across the table, not hostile, not confrontational, but decisive. The neurologist who had questioned her earlier leaned back, his expression thoughtful. If we proceed with her approach, he said slowly, we are not just adjusting a treatment. We are correcting a diagnosis. He glanced toward Dr. Reeves, then back to the screen. And based on what we are seeing, it is the correct call. Another voice followed. I agree. Then another. So do I. The alignment shifted fully, not through argument, but through recognition. The room was no longer divided. It had arrived at the same conclusion, one that had not originated from the center of power, but from the quiet edge where it had almost been ignored. Dr. Reeves remained still for a moment longer, his eyes moving from the data to Sarah, then back again. The weight of leadership did not disappear in that moment, but it changed. It became something heavier, something that required acknowledgement rather than control. He reached for his pen again, the same pen that had hovered over the previous decision, and paused briefly before speaking. Update the treatment protocol, he said, his voice steady, but different now. Incorporate the metabolic and autoimmune framework. The words carried across the room, not as a command that silenced others, but as a confirmation of what had already been accepted. Sarah did not react outwardly. She did not smile, did not shift, did not claim the moment. She simply stood there, composed, as the board began to move with renewed purpose, their actions now guided by a direction they had not seen before she spoke. And in that quiet transition, something far more significant than a medical decision had taken place. The room had not just changed its conclusion. It had changed who it was willing to listen to. The room did not erupt into applause or celebration. It moved in a quieter, more deliberate rhythm, the kind that followed a realization too significant to treat lightly. Physicians who moments ago had been certain of their conclusions now spoke in lower tones, coordinating updates, adjusting timelines, recalibrating their approach with a level of focus that carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Laptops reopened, notes were revised, and the large screen at the front of the room no longer displayed a fixed diagnosis, but a living framework, evolving in real time. Sarah stepped back slightly, returning to the edge of the table where she had started, her presence once again understated, but no longer invisible. Across the room, a senior immunologist approached the display, pointing to one of the metabolic markers Sarah had highlighted earlier. We should run an extended panel to confirm the imbalance, he said, his voice thoughtful, no longer authoritative, but collaborative. Another physician nodded. And adjust the monitoring intervals. If the cycles are as precise as she described, we need to catch the next fluctuation in real time. The coordination unfolded naturally now, each suggestion building on the last, the room functioning not as a hierarchy, but as a system aligned around a shared understanding. At the head of the table, Dr. Reeves remained seated, watching the shift with a composed expression that revealed very little, but his silence carried a different weight than before. It was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence of recognition. He glanced once more toward Sarah, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than it had at any point earlier in the meeting. Dr. Mitchell, he said, his voice cutting through the room, not loudly, but clearly enough to bring everything to a pause. Conversation stopped. Heads turned again, but this time, not in curiosity or skepticism, but in expectation. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Your assessment, he continued, choosing his words carefully, has altered the course of this case. There was no condescension in his tone now, no dismissal, only a measured acknowledgement that carried more weight than any overt praise. A few members exchanged glances, the significance of the moment settling in quietly. He continued, why were these findings not included in the initial review? The question hung in the air, not accusatory, but searching. Sarah held his gaze for a brief moment before responding. Because I was not asked to contribute, she said simply. The honesty of it landed with a clarity that no one in the room could deflect. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no bitterness, just a statement of fact. The room fell into a deeper silence than before, one that carried a different kind of weight. Several members shifted in their seats, their earlier assumptions now impossible to ignore. Dr. Reeves did not respond immediately. His expression remained composed, but something in his posture changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the foundation of his authority had been quietly adjusted. He gave a small nod, not dramatic, not performative, but deliberate. "That will be corrected," he said. The statement was brief, but final. Around the table, the board resumed its work, but the atmosphere had transformed. Conversations were more measured, more inclusive, as if the room itself had learned something in real time. And at the far end, where she had first been overlooked, Sarah Mitchell stood in quiet composure, no longer needing to prove anything, because the room had already done that for her. And in that moment, the silence that filled the space was no longer empty. It was earned. The meeting did not end with a dramatic declaration. It unfolded into a quiet transition, the kind that signaled something deeper had shifted beneath the surface. The board members continued refining the updated protocol, but their movements were more deliberate now, their voices lower, their certainty replaced with careful precision. The large screen displayed revised treatment pathways, each adjustment reflecting the framework Sarah had introduced, each decision now anchored in a perspective that had not existed in the room an hour earlier. One by one, the physicians began to close their laptops, not out of dismissal, but completion. The case that had once seemed settled had been reopened, redefined, and ultimately redirected. At the far end of the table, Sarah gathered her notes with the same quiet efficiency she had shown when she first arrived. No one stopped her. No one questioned her presence anymore. But something had changed in the way they looked at her. It was subtle, almost unspoken, but unmistakable. Across the room, the neurologist who had initially dismissed the anomalies approached her, his posture less rigid than before. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his tone measured. "Your interpretation of the fluctuation intervals, it was precise." He paused briefly, as if choosing his words more carefully than he was accustomed to. "We should have seen it." Sarah met his gaze calmly. "You will next time," she replied, not as a correction, but as a simple truth. He gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged both respect and realization, before stepping away. Nearby, another physician hesitated before speaking. "Those studies you referenced," she said, "they are not widely circulated. Most of us were not aware of them." Sarah adjusted the papers in her hands. "They are not easy to find," she said, "unless you are looking for them." The statement carried no judgment, only clarity. The physician considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling in. At the head of the table, Dr. Reeves stood, his presence once again drawing the room's attention, but the dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. He looked around the table briefly, then towards Sarah. "This board prides itself on expertise," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "But expertise without awareness is incomplete." The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt them. He continued, "Today's outcome was not the result of hierarchy. It was the result of insight." A quiet stillness followed, not heavy, not tense, but reflective. He did not elaborate further. He did not need to. The message had already settled into the room. Sarah paused near the edge of the table, her hand resting lightly against the back of her chair as she listened. There was no reaction on her face, no outward acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place, only the same composed presence she had carried from the beginning. Around her, the room resumed its movement, but it was different now. Conversations included pauses. Decisions included questions. And voices that might have once been overlooked were no longer dismissed so easily. As Sarah turned to leave, the glass walls reflected the city beyond, the same skyline, the same movement below, unchanged by what had just happened inside. But within that room, something had been rewritten. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that could not be undone. And as the door closed quietly behind her, the silence that followed was not empty. It was understanding. The hallway outside the conference room was quiet, the kind of quiet that followed decisions too significant to be spoken about immediately. Sarah walked at an even pace, her steps measured against the polished floor, the distant hum of the hospital returning as the glass doors closed behind her. Inside that room, the shift had already begun to ripple outward, moving through departments, through protocols, through decisions that would now carry a different kind of awareness. She did not look back. She did not need to. Moments like that were never about recognition in real time. They were about what changed after. Down the corridor, a nurse passed by, offering a polite nod, unaware of the impact that had just unfolded upstairs. Monitors beeped softly from nearby patient rooms, steady and consistent, reminders that every decision made behind closed doors eventually reached places like this. Sarah slowed briefly near a window overlooking the city, her reflection faint against the glass, the skyline stretching far beyond in quiet motion. 5 years earlier, she had stood in a different room, in a different hospital, presenting research that few people had been willing to hear. The same pattern, the same dismissal, the same quiet certainty that others knew better. Back then, she had not stayed. She had stepped away, choosing distance over confrontation, choosing observation over recognition. Not because she lacked the knowledge, but because she understood something most people in those rooms did not. Being right was not enough. Timing mattered. Context mattered. And sometimes, the room had to be ready to listen before the truth could be heard. Behind her, the conference room door opened again, footsteps approaching with a different urgency than before. Dr. Mitchell. The voice carried down the hallway, firm but not commanding. She turned slightly to see Dr. Reeves approaching, his posture still composed, but his pace more direct than it had been inside. He stopped a few feet away, the distance measured, deliberate. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The authority he carried was still present, but it had changed shape, no longer positioned above, but alongside something else. There are not many who would have challenged that room the way you did, he said finally, his tone steady, stripped of its earlier distance. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unchanged. I did not challenge the room, she replied calmly. I corrected the direction. The distinction was subtle, but it landed with quiet precision. Dr. Reeves nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something beyond the words themselves. We will be reviewing our internal processes, he said. Inclusion, data evaluation, case input. He paused, then added, your insight should have been part of that from the beginning. Sarah did not respond immediately. She looked past him for a moment, toward the corridor that led deeper into the hospital, where the work never stopped, where decisions translated into outcomes that could not be undone. Then make sure the next voice is heard sooner, she said. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a standard. Dr. Reeves held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that did not seek approval, but accepted responsibility. There was nothing more to add. No formal acknowledgement. No extended exchange. The moment had already said what it needed to say. Sarah turned and continued down the hallway, her figure blending once more into the quiet rhythm of the hospital, indistinguishable to most, but no longer underestimated by those who had witnessed what had happened. And behind her, in a room that had once been defined by titles and authority, there remained a silence that carried a different meaning now. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of understanding. And that day, without announcement, without ceremony, the definition of expertise in that room had quietly changed.